April 7th, 1990. The Scandinavian Star is making its way from Oslo, Norway to Denmark. It's a 19-year-old 465-foot passenger ship. A ship made of 8 decks holding 383 passengers and 97 crew members. But today it will be known for one of the deadliest maritime disasters in Scandinavian history. The events that are about to unfold will highlight the lack of safety, lack of leadership, and negligence that was going on board. And the aftermath that would follow would lead to charges, conspiracies, and questions that still haven't been answered to this day. The Scandinavian Star is currently under ownership of a Norwegian shipping line, Dano. However, that wasn't always the case. Previously, it was serving as a casino cruise ship owned by Sea Escape Limited. However, after it was sold in March, the new shipping company would quickly begin its conversion into a passenger ship. With the conversion came an entirely new crew. Normally, a crew takes about 6 to 8 weeks for proper training for a ship of this size. However, the Scandinavian Star would get all the training done in just 10 days. On top of this issue was another concern: the language barrier. Most of the crew were Portuguese and didn't speak English, Norwegian, or Danish. This would further hamper the crew's ability to give effective direction in an emergency. And that emergency is just about to begin. The time is approximately 1:45 a.m. A small fire has been started outside of cabin 416 on the port side of deck 4. It is simply a bundle of bedcloths sitting outside the cabin. The fire is discovered not by crew members, but by passengers, who begin their efforts of trying to put it out. The commotion causes several crew members to appear and aid in helping extinguish the fire. Other crew members ran to spread word of the fire. After receiving news of the fire, the officer of the watch, the first officer, woke up the captain by telephone. He would relay that someone is playing pyromania, implying that someone on board had just tried to commit arson. This is Captain Hugo Larsen. The 56-year-old has been running this particular shipping route from Norway to Denmark since November 1985, when he was in the service of another ship, and he has held a master's certificate since June 1968. By all records, he's an experienced captain. However, he is also fairly new to the ship. He was hired to captain the ship back in March, only a few weeks ago. After making his way up to the bridge, Captain Hugo Larsen would send the first officer down to the scene of the fire. However, he would go down without a walkie-talkie, so communication back to the bridge would have been difficult. Once down there, the first officer would tell passengers to return to their rooms. After making some basic observations, he would return to the bridge. After hearing that the fire was under control, the captain took no further actions. We'll come back to this later. This fire was successfully put out, and it's not what caused this disaster. What caused this disaster was the second fire outside of cabin 219 on deck 3. This, of course, occurred around 2 a.m. and was not spotted until it was already out of control. After receiving news of the second fire, the captain ordered the first officer to sound the general alarm. This, of course, woke up the sleeping crew members, who would then go on to show how disorganized this ship really was. Normally, during a fire, crew members are all pre-assigned specific duties. Some are supposed to fight the fire, some are supposed to try and contain the fire, and some are supposed to help evacuate passengers. But that's not the case for this crew. Some tried to reach their stations in the engine room, some would run to the bridge to find out what's going on, others would go to deck 7 to try and prepare the lifeboats, and the rest would try to help passengers escape their cabins. All of them would act individually and without any organized effort, thus rendering much of their actions ineffective. During this time, some of the manual fire alarms would be sounded throughout the ship. According to reports, it was mostly pulled by passengers on board. Speaking of fire safety equipment, normally ships have automatic fire doors. When a fire is detected, the fire doors close automatically. Now, these doors are heavy, but not locked. So in the event of a fire, if a passenger is stuck on the wrong side, they can just push them open. However, on this particular ship, the fire doors are manual. To contain the fire, Captain Larson would close the fire doors wherever the fire alarms had been sounded, not noticing that the fire had already spread to many places where no crew nor passengers had the chance to ring the alarm. During this time, some passengers from each of the decks would try to make their escape. Yes, that's right, only some of the passengers. You see, the passengers are supposed to be alerted by a fire alarm in the event of a fire. However, these alarms were poorly positioned and the sound couldn't reach many of the cabins. This, combined with the noise of the engines, the many twisting hallways, and cabin doors, resulted in many of the passengers never hearing the alarm. It also didn't help that certain horns that were marked on the fire plan were missing. As for the passengers making their way outside in the hallways, it still wasn't easy. The passageways were twisting and confusing. One infamous example would be Deck 5. Many passengers would be found trapped at the end of a hallway, trying to make their way out, not realizing that the exit wasn't at the end of the hallway, but a few meters before it. In the thick smoke, many passengers would lose their life, trapped, looking for a way out. As for the staff, again, not many spoke a common language of the area, and even if they did, they weren't drilled correctly in fire safety protocol and evacuation, so their help was mostly ineffective. But first, let's take a moment and talk about the smoke really quickly. Although the walls and ceilings are lined with fireproof asbestos silicate, there was a thin sheet of laminate plastic attached to all the walls and ceilings throughout the ship. It was installed as a purely decorative material, with no practical function whatsoever. And it was this material that was highly flammable. But what's worse is that when burned, it produces two toxic chemicals, carbon monoxide and hydrogen cyanide. The latter is a gas infamously used for gas chambers in concentration camps during World War II. At around this time, Captain Larson would bring the ship's speed to 0. He would also then realize that the ventilation system was spreading the fire. This prompted him to turn it off. However, this would have some unintended consequences. The cabins on board were being overpressurized by the ventilation. In other words, it was keeping a lot of the smoke out. After the air conditioning was turned off, the cabins then became underpressurized, or in other words, they started sucking the smoke into cabins from the hallway. This is how many of the passengers were awakened, by smoke entering their cabins. At 2:24 a.m., Captain Larson was signaled Mayday. At the same time, he requested assistance from the Scandinavian, a cruise ship that was on the same course and only 4 nautical miles ahead. Captain Nordgren would hear the response and immediately set course to render aid. His ship would be the first to reach the Star, and would direct the other ships when they arrived to help as well. At 3 a.m., the first officer would ask Captain Larson if he should start launching the lifeboats. The captain agreed. At around 3:10 a.m., Captain Larson would go on to make some announcements over the PA system, informing the passengers and the crew that there was a fire and they needed to head to the boat deck, and the Scandinavian was close by. Take note, at no point did the captain ever give special messages or instructions to the crew. Also, no walkie-talkies were ever used during this time either. Again, we'll come back to all of this later. At around 3:20 a.m., 8 of the 10 lifeboats would be lowered into the sea. This last lifeboat was special though. It contained many of the officers, including the captain. The captain knowing full well that there were still people on board. At 3:28 a.m., Captain Larson and Captain Nordgren would have the following conversation over the walkie-talkie. Have both passengers and crew abandoned ship? Yes, all of them. Everybody off the ship. Even the crew? Confirm, even the crew. Yes, even the crew. Yes. Is there no one left on board the ship? Well, no one that we know of. So if there is anyone left on board, it's quite impossible to know. We've taken everyone that we know of and think. However, not all the crew members had abandoned ship just yet. This is Staff Captain Karsten Hansen. The Staff Captain is the officer in charge of the more technical side of the ship. He had only come on board on the 1st of April, so about 6 days ago. Even with his limited familiarity of the layout, he was still in the interior of the ship. He, along with some of the other crew members, had equipped some of the smoke diving gear and were making their way through the passageways. They were going from cabin to cabin, trying to reach as many passengers on board that hadn't made their way out yet. As you can guess, with the vast majority of the crew evacuated, very few were left to help passengers that were left behind. At 3:31 a.m., Captain Nordgren contacts a Danish rescue helicopter. All crew and passengers have abandoned the ship, are in lifeboats, and some of them have been taken on board here, and some have been taken on board other ships, and to the best of my knowledge, there is nobody left on board. At 3:34 a.m., Captain Nordgren contacts Rescue Helicopter 278. The captain of the Scandinavian Star has reported to me that there is nobody left on board. They are all on lifeboats or have been taken aboard other ships. But I have other information saying that there are people on board the Scandinavian Star, which is on fire, and are investigating right now. At 3:38 a.m., Captain Nordgren calls into Shuma Radio. We have enough resources right now. What we need are smoke divers who can go on board and search it for survivors. They respond, okay, I shall try and get a hold of them. As for the staff captain and the passengers he and his crew helped rescue, they would also evacuate the ship via helicopter at around this time. As for the smoke divers, they wouldn't reach the ship until around 5:45 a.m. At 7:10 a.m., the fireboats would reach the ship and begin using water cannons to extinguish the fire. At 11:55 a.m., the ship would be towed towards Lysekil, Sweden. During the entire journey, the extinguishing would continue, and at 9:17 p.m., the ship would be berthed there. The actual fire wouldn't be fully extinguished until 4 p.m. Sunday, on April 8th, a full 38 hours after the fire began. Of the 99 crew members and 383 passengers, 159 people died, nearly a third of everyone on board. On April 7, 2006, a memorial was inaugurated in Oslo, Norway. It features a mother carrying her baby and leading another child, a small boy who reaches back for his dropped teddy bear. Also, it contains a large commemorative plaque with the names of all the victims of the fire. So clearly, many things went wrong for the Scandinavian Star, from the structure of the ship to the captain's poor decision-making to the crew's poor training. It was like a perfect storm of events that had to line up for a disaster like this to happen. That's why a committee was set up to review this case. In fact, that's where the vast majority of the information I used for this story comes from. The report itself is a little over 200 pages of evaluations and recommendations, in case anyone's interested in looking into it. They had some pretty condemning opinions. For example, the captain leaving the ship early, him not releasing all the fire doors at once, not to mention during the entire ordeal, the captain never made any effort to organize a team to help fight the fire. In fact, they have an entire evacuation plan just for this occasion. The committee was also fairly critical towards the crew's performance during the evacuation. But for me personally, the most incriminating part of all of this was the captain's actions. It was when Captain Larson decided to lie to Captain Nordgren about any passengers left on board. I find it very hard to believe that the captain didn't know that there were still some passengers left on board. I mean, how can you not tell a third of your people are still missing? Not to mention that his staff captain was still missing as well. Remember, he's still below deck looking for survivors. In fact, the entire reason that Captain Nordgren's crew didn't immediately go to get survivors was because of what Captain Larson had told him earlier. You see, the crew on board the Stena Saga also has smoke divers. Well, to be clear, there are two types of smoke divers. One is a certified smoke diver, with a certificate that shows limited experience and competency. The crew on board both the Stena Saga and the Scandinavian Star had this certification. And then there are professional smoke divers, people who are well experienced in this field. And that's what Captain Nordgren had radioed in for earlier. His reasoning for not sending his own smoke divers in was due to his belief that the crew on the Scandinavian Star had already conducted the evacuation to the extent of their abilities in smoke diving gear. Plus, there shouldn't even be anyone else on board. Or at least, that's according to Captain Larson. In the report, there are more points that cover the interior of the ship and have to do with the management of fire alarms, the open fire doors, and those laminate sheets that line the walls. However, this video is getting pretty long, and I think people want to know if anyone gets held responsible legally. Well, in November of 1993, Captain Larson, Danish shipowner Henrik Johansen, and former shipping line director Ole B. Hansen were sentenced to 6 months in jail for negligence. In my opinion, they got off pretty lightly. But let's talk about the fate of the ship and its owners really quickly. The burnt ship was towed to Copenhagen, Denmark on April 18, 1990. It arrived there in 2 days and remained there for several months. On August 11, 1990, she was towed to the United Kingdom, first arriving in Hull before moving on to Southampton on September 10th, where the vessel was renamed Candy by simply painting over part of the ship's original name. In February 1994, she was sold at auction to International Shipping Partners, where the ship was renamed to the Regal Voyage. And in 2004, was sold to shipbreakers to be scrapped. The Norwegian shipping line operating the ship went bankrupt that same year in 1990. The captain of the ship, Hugo Larsen, died in 2020. As for the director and owner, I'm not too sure what happened to them, but they aren't in the shipping industry anymore. And apparently ship director Hansen didn't want to serve his prison sentence and fled to Spain and Liberia until his sentence expired. Yeah, wild stuff. You can't make this up. But there's still one question that people are asking. Who started the fire? The main fire didn't start near any electronics, nor did it start near any of the engines. It was pretty clear to everyone that it was arson. This is Erik Andersen, a 37-year-old Danish truck driver who died in the disaster. He had 3 previous convictions for arson. For the Norwegian police, he was the main suspect for the cause of the fire. Case closed for the investigators. But some people didn't like that answer. To them, there were too many things that just didn't add up. In 2013, a report was created on the fire by an independent fire investigation team. They basically worked backwards to find the source of each fire to determine their starting points. Their conclusion? They found that there were probably 6 different fires that night. We've already covered the first 2 earlier in the video. The 3rd fire was caused by a bent pipe on deck 4, a pipe that had been forcefully pulled by a human. A 4th and 5th fire were attempted, but caused no significant damage. And finally, the 6th fire was caused on Sunday morning, when the ship was already docked at Lysekil. As for the arsonist, Erik Andersen, he had died in the 2nd fire, so it would be impossible for him to start the other 4 fires, and very unlikely for him to start the first 2. No, it seemed that the fire was created by a coordinated effort of a group of people that were familiar with the layout of the ship. Another claim that was made was that the whole thing happened because of insurance fraud. People had looked into the financial circumstances that surrounded this case, and things looked pretty suspicious. For example, after the ship was bought, it was insured for twice its value without any major changes that would add such value. And after the fire, the ship's value dropped to 0, allowing the shipping company to claim the full value. In 2014, Norwegian police would reopen the case to examine for any claims of insurance fraud. According to them, they found no evidence of this. However, charges would be dropped against Anderson after this. In March of 2015, the Parliament in Norway decided to remove the statute of limitations for arson, the idea being that criminal investigations and prosecution still remain possible. In February of 2016, the retired Danish investigator, Flemming Jensen, who had led the post-fire investigation in 1990, claimed that the fire was sabotage and was set by members of the ship's crew. The fire doors had been propped open to allow the fire to spread, and that a third flare-up that occurred after the ship had been evacuated passengers was caused by crew members soaking mattresses with diesel fuel. In 2018, the Norway Parliament confirms no foul play in the Scandinavian Star ship fire. They stated that there is no evidence that the disaster was caused by sabotage. Okay, so this kind of got under my skin. What do you mean there wasn't any evidence of sabotage? There were eyewitnesses for the first fire. A fire started with rolled up bed sheets. Then a second fire happens to appear at a different location only a few minutes later. To me, that's clearly arson. Or who knows, maybe it was a coincidence. Or maybe it was magic. Or something like that. Anyways, moving on. In 2020, a 6-hour Nordic documentary was released about the disaster, and it contained quite a few allegations. Following the documentary, the Danish Parliament voted to initiate a government hearing on the case. In May of 2021, the case would be reopened. In late 2022, survivors and families of the deceased entered a lawsuit against Denmark for damages. As for the present status of the Scandinavian Star case, I don't know. That's all I could find. I think it still leaves a bad feeling for everyone that was involved. No one knows for sure what happened or who started the fire. When I first heard about this case, I had no idea how deep the rabbit hole goes. I just assumed I would be making another 10-minute video or something. Boy, was I wrong. I know for a fact that there's a few things I didn't get into or cover, but I do think I did cover the majority of events. Well, I hope I was able to help everyone understand this disaster a little bit better. I'll be back when I find another case that I think is interesting. Until next time, later.